This video explains gestation or pregnancy. What is the difference between copulation and fertilization? It's quite important to know the difference between these two words and don't confuse them. If you're writing in an exam and your marker sees that you don't know the difference between copulation and fertilization, they'll often be quite doubtful about how much else you know, and they'll often tend to mark you less kindly. So copulation is the same as sexual intercourse, or we often say coitus, which is the transfer of sperm into the vagina of the female when the male sex organ, the penis, is inserted and sperm are deposited near the cervix, so near the bottom of the uterus. After copulation, fertilization can occur. Fertilization is the fusion of the sperm nucleus with the egg nucleus to form a diploid cell known as the zygote. Fertilization definition is quite important to use. You'll see every now and then in the test, they will ask you to define fertilization or to explain it. If we look more at fertilization, fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube in the oviduct when the nucleus of the sperm and the nucleus of the egg fuse and form a zygote. Semen must first be deposited in the vagina. After that occurs, the sperm moves through the cervix, this narrowing of the uterus, up through the uterus and into the fallopian tube until they reach the egg. The egg has been sucked by the fallopian tube by the action of the fimbria, which are these like lettuce-like outgrowths of the end of the fallopian tube. Once the egg has been sucked into the fallopian tube, it moves along the fallopian tube by the actions of the muscles of the fallopian tube and the cilia. And fertilization usually occurs in the top part of the fallopian tube, so around here. You can see just another image of how fertilization occurs. The penis is inserted, sperm is ejaculated, it moves up through the uterus into the fallopian tube. The egg is then fertilized, and the egg moves then along the fallopian tube where it's implanted in the uterine wall. So we know that the sperm has hydrolytic enzymes in its acrosome, which is found in the head of the sperm, and then the sperm uses this to disintegrate the protective membrane of the egg to penetrate inside so that its nucleus can fuse with the egg's nucleus. Once the egg has been penetrated, the egg releases a fertilization membrane to prevent any other sperm from penetrating the egg. So we can see there that the rest of the sperm that haven't penetrated the egg are now being blocked by this fertilization membrane. After fertilization occurs in the oviduct, the zygote first becomes a blastocyte, then an embryo, and then a fetus through mitosis, so the continuous division of cells. What's the difference between an embryo and a fetus? So between the zygote, well, there's a tiny stage where it's the blastocyte, and then up to the first 8 weeks, we refer to the developing baby as an embryo. During this time, the organs of the body are being formed by differentiation, so the cells are starting to specialize. After 8 weeks, so after the organs have fully specialized, we call it a fetus. So further growth and organ specialization takes place. It's important to know the structure and the function of the placenta, the umbilical cord, the amnion, and the amniotic fluid. We can see there's the placenta, and the uterus is that entire structure in which the baby is developing. So if we first look at the placenta, it's a disc-shaped temporary organ, and it's an organ that belongs to the mother, not the baby. It's obviously temporary because we don't always have a placenta, only when you're giving birth. And it's richly supplied with both maternal and fetal blood vessels. It connects the fetus with the mother's blood at the end of the umbilical cord. So we can see here that this would be the uterus, obviously on its side. There's the placenta, which is attached to the uterine wall. There's the fetus, and there's the umbilical cord. The placenta is the organ by means of which the embryo is attached to the wall of the uterus, and through which oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide, and wastes are exchanged. So we can understand that oxygen and nutrients are given to the baby by the mother, and the baby's carbon dioxide and its wastes are exchanged out back to the mother, who will then excrete it from her body. The placenta is formed by the chorion and its villi that penetrate the endometrium, which we know is the vascular lining of the uterine wall. The villi, which are these like structured here, provide a large surface area of attachment of the placenta to the endometrium. So the chorion, which is a structure of the a basic amniotic egg, we can see here that this is the chorion, this pink layer on the outside, has villi which hook the embryo into the endometrium, so they almost fuse together to secure the chorion onto there. Once it's attached, the chorion and the endometrium together become the placenta. Each villus, so a single villi, contain a large capillary network, which provides a large surface area for exchange of substances by diffusion. So obviously this is quite a common question. They can ask you, how does the structure of the villi maximize its function? And we know that it has the villi contain a capillary network to provide a large surface area for exchanging substances by diffusion. Because it's got lots of capillaries and lots of capillary networks, and these capillaries are very thin, they're only 1 cell thick, so diffusion can occur rapidly. This maximizes the rate of diffusion across the placenta, so to exchange gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients, and remove waste. We know that a capillary is 1 cell layer thin for a rapid and efficient diffusion. So we can see here, if we look at the one of the villi, the fetal blood is here, where there's a fetal vein and fetal artery, and this would be the umbilical cord. Sorry, umbilical vein and umbilical arteries. This is the umbilical cord, and then on this side is the mother's blood. So the myometrium, the other wall of the uterus, would be on this side, and the fetus would be here. This is the villi from the chorion, and the blood isn't in the veins. So diffusion occurs here. This is the only place which we'll see where the mother's blood leaves her body. But it's very, very important to know that the baby's and the mother's blood will not actually come into contact, only the substances within them. So the placental villi are surrounded by the mother's blood, so that the mother's blood supply and the fetal capillaries are very close to each other. So the maternal blood vessels surrounding the chorionic villi break down, bathing the villi in pools of blood. So like I said, this is the only time where the blood leaves the vessels. So I'm sure you've learned by now that mammals have a closed circulatory system, which means that blood doesn't leave the veins and the arteries. This is the only exception to that rule. During pregnancy within the placenta, the mother's blood leaves her body and then obviously goes back in. The important thing to know is that the fetal and the mother's blood don't mix, because the fetal blood never leaves these vessels. This is because sometimes the fetus and the mother usually have different blood types, and if you get the wrong blood type in your veins, so for example, if the baby is AB and the mother is, I don't know, B, and the baby's blood by mistake goes into the mother's blood, she'll get the wrong antibodies, which is very, very dangerous, and vice versa if it goes into the baby's blood. So the only thing that exchanges are the gases, nutrients, sometimes even the plasma of the blood, but not the blood cells. The fetal capillaries have thin walls, as we said, only 1 cell thick, so that they can move by diffusion. The functions of the placenta are very important. Of course, the primary one, or one of the primary ones, is gaseous exchange, so to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, to remove waste such as uric acid, so from urine, from the fetal blood, to pass nutrients from the mother to the fetus, nutrients like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, iron, and vitamins for the baby to grow and develop. Progesterone is also secreted by the placenta. So we saw when we were looking at the menstrual cycle that progesterone was secreted by the corpus luteum during the menstrual cycle, and if fertilization didn't occur and so implantation didn't occur, we saw that the corpus luteum degenerated. So there was no progesterone left to promote the development of the endometrium. That's why you lose your endometrium during menstruation. Now we see that if fertilization does occur and implantation does occur, the placenta takes over from the corpus luteum in secreting progesterone to maintain the endometrium lining and prevent a miscarriage. So after 3 months of pregnancy, the placenta takes over from secreting progesterone and estrogen from the ovaries, from the corpus luteum. And it prevents ovulation because it keeps levels of FSH and LH very low. And it prevents menstruation because it keeps the endometrial lining from shedding, which of course, either of which would result in the loss of a fetus. One thing to note is that that when we looked at menstruation, we saw that the corpus luteum only lasted about 10 to 12 days, and then it degenerated. So when I was studying this, I was quite confused. I said, how can it last for 12 days, but the placenta only take over after 3 months? What happens between 12 days and 3 months? You don't need to stress about this. There is another hormone that controls it for a period, but it's not important for the biosyllabus. So for now, all you need to know is that if fertilization doesn't occur, the corpus luteum controls progesterone until it degenerates and menstruation occurs. If fertilization does occur, the placenta takes over from the corpus luteum. More functions of the placenta are to provide some maternal antibodies to the fetus, which provides temporary passive immunity to certain diseases. So it's temporary because only when it's a fetus. And it's passive immunity because it's given by the mother. It's not made by the fetus itself. The placenta also protects the embryo from possible infection and from harmful substances, but it can't protect from everything. It doesn't always know what to distinguish what's good and what's not. And that's why things like alcohol, caffeine, herbal substances, and drugs shouldn't be taken during pregnancy because this can severely harm the baby. The functions of the placenta are also to act as a barrier, so like a microfilter, to prevent some other pathogenic microorganisms from entering the fetus. However, some organisms can pass through the fetus, such as rubella, syphilis, and HIV. This is just interest about the weight of the placenta, and this is a picture of the placenta. If you're a bit squeamish, scroll through this. So then if we look at the umbilical cord, we can see that this here is the placenta, with there being the outer part being the uterine wall, here being the main part of the placenta, and this is the umbilical cord. This is the cord that connects the embryo to the placenta in mammals, so it joins the fetus to its mother, and it contains 1 vein and 2 arteries. One of the important things to know about this is that when we usually think about veins and arteries, we usually think about arteries being the ones that carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. This is the other way around in the fetus, for the umbilical artery and vein. So what we got to know is that always, whether it's in umbilical arteries and veins or whether it's in the rest of the mother and the rest of humans, always arteries carry blood away from the heart and veins carry blood to the heart. So your carotid artery carries blood, I think, to the brain. So that's away from the heart to the brain, and your carotid vein carries blood from the brain to the heart. And it's the same in the umbilical arteries, but now we're talking about the baby's heart because it's the baby's veins and arteries. So the umbilical artery carries blood away from the baby's heart. The umbilical vein carries blood to the baby's heart. However, because like I said, we usually think of arteries as carrying oxygenated blood, which makes sense if we look at something like the carotid vein, which is carrying it to the brain, or carotid artery, as the carotid artery would carry oxygen produced or kind of made by the lungs and the heart, carry it to the brain, and then get used in the brain, and then that vein would carry oxygenated blood back to the heart. However, when we look at the baby, in the fetus, it's not yet breathing on its own and its heart is not yet making its own oxygenated blood, which means that the mother has to do it for the child. That's why the umbilical vein, which carries blood to the heart, has to carry oxygenated blood to the heart, so that the heart has a supply of oxygen, which it will then pump to the rest of the body. The umbilical artery, which carries blood away from the heart and back to the placenta, would carry deoxygenated blood because it's carrying it back to the mother so that the carbon dioxide can diffuse out into the mother's body and she can excrete it. I don't know if that makes sense. Don't let it overcomplicate, or don't let it confuse you, but that's just what you've got to remember. So if we look at it here, the umbilical veins enter the fetus and carry oxygenated blood and nutrients from the mother to the baby's heart. The umbilical arteries leave the fetus carrying deoxygenated blood as well as waste, such as uric acid and used waste products, and these then diffuse into the mother's blood and are excreted by the mother. Then if we look at the amnion, this is a membrane that encloses the embryo within the amniotic cavity. So we can see that there's the placenta. Inside here is the amniotic fluid, and this kind of blue bubble sort of thing would be the amnion. So the amnion encloses the embryo. The placenta isn't inside the amnion. We can see the placenta here is on the outside, but the umbilical cord is inside the amnion, of course, because it has to reach the fetus. And the amnion forms this amniotic cavity, which is filled with amniotic fluid. What is amniotic fluid? Amniotic fluid is the fluid that surrounds the developing fetus, providing a protective environment. It mostly consists of water, a few fetal cells, and some waste products. And as I said here, it contains some fetal cells, which means that it contains fetal genetic information in the nuclei of these cells. That's why during an amniocentesis, they can inject into the amniotic fluid as opposed to into the fetus itself, and determine whether it has any chromosomal abnormalities, such as Down syndrome. The amniotic fluid has a few very essential functions. Some of these are to support the developing fetus, so it allows it to move about freely in this liquid environment so that it can exercise its muscles and strengthen its bones. It also prevents any malformations due to gravity or pressure, because the liquid prevents the full force of gravity from being exerted on the developing fetus. The fluid also provides lubrication that keeps the body from growing together. When you see something like webbed toes and fingers, that could be a result of not enough amniotic fluid in the uterus. The amniotic fluid also protects the fetus from damage by external injury or by impact from the mother, like a liquid shock absorber. It also provides a medium to practice breathing and swallowing, which helps the baby's lungs develop. Because the baby can swallow this amniotic fluid, it can pass through its digestive system, its kidneys, its bladder, and to the amniotic sac as urine. In this way, the baby can practice its digestive and urinary systems before it's born. And the amniotic fluid holds urine as it's released from the fetus. It also protects the fetus against temperature changes and against dehydration. Here's a picture of the developing embryo. And another picture. That's as it's being born, where the amnion is actually not being burst. And the same here. So some of the hormones controlling pregnancy, labor, and birth, we're going to look at in a bit more detail here. These ones in green, such as HCG, don't stress about them, they can't be tested. So if we look at progesterone, we did speak about this a bit earlier and during the menstrual cycle, but we spoke about it in terms of the menstrual cycle, about how progesterone worked usually when implantation and fertilization didn't occur. Now we can look at it when fertilization has occurred. So it's, as we said, produced by the corpus luteum initially and then by the placenta. It maintains the endometrium to prevent a miscarriage. So it ensures that this uterine wall is lined with vascular, with blood vessels and nutrients. So the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, makes this follicle, which develops into a Graafian follicle and produces estrogen. So the FSH, we usually say, is responsible for estrogen. The LH makes the corpus luteum because it causes ovulation to occur, which means that the egg is released and the corpus luteum is left in the ovary. And the corpus luteum produces progesterone, does also produce estrogen, but now we focused on progesterone. So we can say that LH is responsible for progesterone. Another hormone controlling pregnancy, labor, and birth is oxytocin. Oxytocin releases endorphins, which makes you feel happy and causes you to kind of block out the pain of pregnancy. It's also released like during exercise. That's why we get such a high during exercise or at the end of exercise. Oxytocin is produced by the hypothalamus in the brain and released by the posterior pituitary gland. It causes contraction of the uterus and dilation, so expansion of the cervix, so it can be used to induce labor. It stimulates the release of milk from the mammary glands when a baby is suckling. You don't have to stress about relaxin. Prolactin is another hormone which is produced and secreted by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Oxytocin we saw was the posterior lobe. Prolactin promotes lactation, which is the production of milk by the mammary glands. So prolactin kicks in slightly earlier than oxytocin. Prolactin is secreting right around birth. In terms of, we're now talking about milk production. And oxytocin is only secreted when the baby sucks. So we saw here that prolactin promotes lactation, which is the breast to produce milk, or the mammary glands to produce milk, whereas oxytocin stimulates the release of milk. If we look at labor and how it's controlled by hormones, this is quite an interesting diagram, but it's a little bit too detailed because we don't even know about something like estriol, prostaglandin, and that sort of thing. So the labor stage can last for a good number of hours. During labor, the cervix dilates to 10 centimeters. We saw in another video that the cervix is originally only at around 2.5 millimeters. So this is massive dilation. The trigger for this dilation of the cervix is oxytocin. Oxytocin is actually produced by the fetus as opposed to the mother, and by the mother's pituitary gland in response to a reduction of progesterone. So oxytocin is produced by both the fetus and the mother. And it occurs when there's less progesterone. So we know that the placenta is the one that produces progesterone, and this we see is a negative feedback loop. Oxytocin stimulates the muscles to contract so that the baby can be pushed out, and it also stimulates the placenta to secrete prostaglandins, which just enhance these contractions as well. The physical and emotional stresses associated with contractions stimulate more oxytocin and prostaglandins. So this is a positive feedback system, and eventually causes expulsion, so birth of the baby. And as I mentioned earlier, these physical and emotional stresses, which are related to an increase in oxytocin, also relate to this endorphins released by the oxytocin, so that we kind of forget the emotional stresses and the physical stresses of oxytocin, which makes females willing to have a baby again. So this is quite a complicated diagram, just showing hormones during the birth period. Parturition is a different word for birth. The main ones to focus on are progesterone, how it decreases before birth, and oxytocin, how it increases just during or before or just after birth. Expulsion is, of course, when the baby is expelled and born, and it usually lasts 2 to 60 minutes. Contractions are 50 to 90 seconds and 1 to 2 minutes apart. So expulsion ends when the baby is pushed through the vagina or the birth canal, and we know that the baby is born with its umbilical cord still attached, and then the doctors will cut the umbilical cord. After the baby is born, the placenta is also delivered. People often call it the afterbirth. When we look at breastfeeding, the pituitary gland produces prolactin, which stimulates milk production. And then when the baby is suckling, the release of oxytocin occurs from the pituitary gland, which causes the mammary gland to contract and release the milk to the baby. And this also triggers the uterus to return to its pre-pregnancy stage. If we just look quickly at an ectopic pregnancy, ectopic literally means out of place. So an ectopic pregnancy is when the egg implants in a place that is not the uterus. So it could occur in any of these places. Probably the most common is in the fallopian tube it implants, and almost always results in a miscarriage because the baby can't develop anywhere other than the uterus. Ectopic pregnancies are quite dangerous. They can be fatal for the mother as well if this organ ruptured, if the ectopic pregnancy is discovered too late. So that's basically the pregnancy. It's just mostly important to know the different structures and their functions.